Black veteran rescues woman and her kids in blizzard. What happened next was unthinkable. Before we share the incredible story of Elias Vance, take a moment to think about a time someone showed you unexpected kindness. A small light in a moment of darkness. Hold that feeling, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we journey to a place where one such act changed everything. The wind was a living thing, a predator that screamed around the corners of the small, weathered cabin. It clawed at the window panes with icy talons and hurled handfuls of snow against the thin wooden walls, each gust a fresh assault on the fragile peace within. Inside, the cold was a presence almost as palpable as the wind. It seeped through the floorboards and radiated from the single-pane glass, a constant, draining pressure. Elias Vance sat at his small kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm water, the last of the propane in his little stove having given out an hour ago. His worn hands, knuckles scarred and swollen from a life of hard work and harder fighting, trembled slightly. It wasn't just the cold. It was the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, an ache that had been his constant companion for weeks. On the table before him lay the three artifacts of his current existence. The first was an unopened can of tomato soup, its cheerful red label a cruel mockery of warmth and sustenance. It was his last can, his last real meal. The second was a crisp, official-looking envelope, the letter inside folded so many times the creases were threatening to tear. It was a final notice of foreclosure from the Havenwood County Bank. The words were burned into his memory. Failure to remit payment. A period of 30 days. Vacate the premises. 30 days had come and gone, swallowed by the relentless march of poverty. The third, and most precious, was a small, framed photograph of his wife, Sarah. Her smile was the only true source of warmth left in his world. She had been gone 2 years now, taken by an illness that had consumed their meager savings and then, mercilessly, her life. He was alone, save for Buster, his aging German shepherd, who lay curled on a threadbare rug by the cold hearth, his soft whimpers a sad harmony to the howling wind. Elias was a man carved from resilience. He had served 2 tours overseas, a lifetime ago, and had returned with a quiet dignity and a deep-seated belief in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. But the world he had fought for seemed to have no place for him. Jobs in a small, fading town like Havenwood were scarce, especially for a black man in his late 50s with a bad back and no taste for groveling. He had worked odd jobs, repaired fences, chopped wood, and fixed engines until his body began to fail him. Now there was nothing, just the cold, the hunger, and the crushing weight of failure. He looked at the soup, then at Buster. The dog hadn't eaten today either. The choice was simple. It wasn't a choice at all. He would open the can for Buster. A man could endure. A loyal friend deserved better. It was in that moment of quiet, desperate resolve that a new sound cut through the blizzard's shriek. It was a terrible, grinding crunch of metal, followed by a sickening thud. Elias stiffened, his head snapping up. He moved to the window, rubbing a clear circle in the frost with the heel of his hand. Out in the swirling white, maybe 50 yards from his cabin where the county road curved sharply, a dark shape was half buried in a snowdrift. A car. An old sedan, its headlights askew, one pointing drunkenly at the sky, the other swallowed by the snow. For a moment he saw nothing else. The world was a maelstrom of white. Then, a flicker of movement. A door was forced open against the wind, and a figure stumbled out, small and frail against the storm's fury. Another followed, even smaller. Then, a third figure, an adult who fell to their knees in the deep snow. A child's cry, thin and sharp as a needle, pierced the wind's roar. It was a sound that bypassed thought and went straight to the soul. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy military-issue peacoat from a hook by the door, the one he'd kept pristine for 2 decades. He pulled on his worn boots, his movements swift and sure, the lethargy of hunger burned away by a sudden surge of purpose. Buster was on his feet, a low growl in his chest. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, his voice raspy. "Stay." He opened the door, and the storm lunged inside. a blast of Arctic air and stinging snow that sent the foreclosure notice skittering across the floor. Elias leaned into the gale, his eyes slitted, and began the trudge toward the wreck. Every step was a battle. The snow was thigh-deep, the wind a physical blow that tried to force him back. He could barely see, but he followed the sound of that desperate, frightened wail. He reached the car to find a woman on her knees, trying to shield two small children huddled behind her. She was wearing a thin jacket, utterly inadequate for the weather, her face pale and streaked with tears. The children, a boy and a girl no older than 6 or 7, were shivering violently, their faces pinched with cold and fear. The woman looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pleading. In a town like Havenwood, a stranger, a large black man appearing out of a blizzard, could be a threat. He saw the fear in her eyes and immediately softened his posture, holding up his empty hands. "Ma'am," he shouted over the wind, "I live just there, my cabin. You and the little ones need to get inside. Now." She hesitated for only a second, a flicker of indecision in her eyes before the desperate cold made the choice for her. She nodded, her teeth chattering too hard to speak. Elias scooped up the smaller child, the little girl, into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. He wrapped his coat around her as best he could. "Come on," he urged the woman. "Take my arm." Quickly he guided them, a small, struggling procession, through the blinding snow, back toward the faint, welcoming yellow light of his cabin window. They stumbled through the door into the relative stillness of the small room, bringing the storm in with them. The woman collapsed onto the nearest chair, her body racked with shudders. The little boy stood frozen, his eyes huge in his small face. Elias gently set the girl down, unwrapping his coat from her. He looked at the three of them, their faces blue-tinged, their clothes soaked. And then he looked at his last can of soup, his empty fireplace, and the single thin blanket on his own bed. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that what little he had was no longer his. His own survival had just become secondary. He had to save them. The cost didn't matter. With a resolve that pushed aside his own gnawing hunger, Elias moved with practiced efficiency. His first priority was warmth. The fireplace stood cold and empty, a brick mouth gaping into the room. His woodpile, once a proud stack that promised weeks of comfort, was now just a few sad splinters and a handful of kindling near the hearth. He had been saving it, rationing it piece by piece for the absolute coldest point of the night. That point had just arrived. He knelt and carefully arranged the last of his precious kindling, adding the 3 small logs that were all that remained. He struck a match, his fingers stiff, and coaxed the tinder into a fragile flame. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the damp wood would refuse to catch, but then a flicker grew into a lick of orange, and soon a small, hungry fire was crackling in the hearth, a defiant roar against the storm outside. It wasn't much, but it was life. He turned to the family. The woman, who introduced herself as Lena, was trying to chafe her children's hands, her own movements clumsy with cold. The kids, a boy named Caleb and a girl named Maya, were huddled together, their shivering a visible tremor. "We need to get you out of those wet things," Elias said, his voice gentle but firm. He went to his modest chest of drawers. His own clothes would be far too big, but they were dry. He pulled out his thickest wool sweater and a pair of old sweatpants. He also retrieved the one quilt he owned, the one Sarah had made years ago. It was heavy and warm, a patchwork of memories. Handing it to her felt like giving away a piece of his heart, but he did so without a second thought. "Here," he said to Lena, passing her the quilt and clothes. "Wrap the children in this. Get them close to the fire." He then went to his own bed and stripped it of its single wool blanket, adding it to the small pile he was creating for them by the growing fire. He turned his back to give them privacy, busying himself at the counter. Now for food. His eyes fell on the solitary can of soup. His stomach clenched with a pang of desperate hunger. It would have been his first real meal in 2 days. But there was no question. He took his army-issue can opener from a hook and punctured the lid. The rich, tomato-scented liquid promised a moment of life-giving heat. He poured it into his only saucepan and set it on the small grate he'd positioned over the fire. While it heated, he found 3 bowls, 2 chipped, 1 cracked, and the 3 spoons he owned. He divided the soup equally among them, a pitifully small amount in the bottom of each. He handed the first bowl to Lena. She looked from the bowl to his face, her eyes searching, and he saw in them a dawning understanding of the sacrifice he was making. Her gaze flickered to the bare cupboards, the stark simplicity of the cabin, the foreclosure notice that had fallen near the door. "You," she started, her voice trembling. "This is all you have, isn't it?" Elias just gave her a small, weary smile. "There's enough," he said, a lie that was also the truest thing he could say. "Eat. The children need it." He gave the other bowls to Caleb and Maya, who took them with trembling hands and began to eat with the ravenous hunger of frightened, frozen children. Elias watched them, the firelight dancing on their faces, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. His own hunger was a distant ache now, muted by the profound rightness of his actions. He was cold, he was starving, and his home was about to be taken from him. But in that moment, as he watched a family eat his last meal, he felt richer than he had in years. He had given them everything he had left in the world. His last food, his last warmth, his last comfort. It was a choice made not from logic, but from a deep, unwavering well of compassion that life had not yet managed to run dry. For now, in this small cabin surrounded by the fury of the storm, 3 strangers were safe. That was enough. As the hours passed, the cabin became a small sanctuary against the unrelenting blizzard. The fire, fed by the last of Elias's wood, held the worst of the cold at bay, casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls. Lena and her children, wrapped in Sarah's quilt and Elias's blanket, were finally warm, their shivering replaced by the exhausted stillness that follows a harrowing ordeal. Caleb and Maya fell into a deep sleep, huddled together on the floor near the hearth, their small faces peaceful in the firelight. Elias sat in his chair, watching over them, while Buster lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to listen to the storm before settling again with a soft sigh. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. Lena, however, did not sleep. She sat on the other side of the hearth, nursing a mug of hot water Elias had given her. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, moved around the small space, taking in every detail. She saw the military precision in the way his few belongings were arranged. She saw the worn Bible on his nightstand, the faded photograph of Sarah on the mantel, and the deep lines of weariness etched around his kind eyes. She saw the strength in him, but also the profound loneliness. "You were in the army," she said, her voice soft. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded, his gaze distant. 101st Airborne. "Long time ago. Thank you for your service," she said, the words carrying a weight of genuine respect. "And thank you for this, for everything. You saved us." He simply nodded again, uncomfortable with praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said, her voice firm, meeting his eyes. "Not everyone." Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, above the photograph of Sarah. It rested on a small, intricately carved object, a wooden raven, its wings half spread, its head cocked as if listening. The wood was dark and polished smooth with age. "That's beautiful," she said. A rare, genuine smile touched Elias's lips. "My Sarah carved that. She had a gift with her hands. Said ravens were smart." "Good luck." Lena stared at the raven, a strange, unreadable expression on her face. It was a look of intense focus, almost recognition. She seemed about to say something more when she noticed the sleeve of her jacket had ridden up, revealing a portion of a tattoo on her forearm. Elias caught a glimpse of black ink, complex lines that looked like the edge of a feathered wing. She quickly pulled her sleeve down, a flicker of guardedness returning to her eyes. "We were running," she said, changing the subject, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "From a bad situation back east. My husband, my kid's father, he's meeting us. We were supposed to get to a motel in the next town. She didn't offer more details, and Elias didn't ask. He understood the language of desperation. He had seen it in war zones, and he saw it now in her haunted eyes. They were survivors just like him. They spent the next day trapped as the storm raged on. A timeless period of shared existence. Elias found a forgotten bag of rice in the back of a cupboard. A small miracle, and they cooked it over the fire, stretching the meager meal as far as it could go. They talked, not about the pasts that haunted them, but about simple things. The children's favorite colors, the way the snow muffled the world, the memory of sunshine. A fragile trust began to form in the warm bubble of the cabin. Lena saw not a poor, destitute man, but a person of immense honor. Elias saw not a victim, but a woman of fierce, protective strength. They were two souls adrift in a storm, finding a momentary, shared harbor. Yet, the question of who she was, and who she was running to, hung unspoken in the air, a mystery as thick as the swirling snow outside. By the second morning, the wind had finally subsided, leaving behind a world transformed. A thick, pristine blanket of snow covered everything, muffling all sound and reflecting the pale morning light with a blinding intensity. The world was beautiful and treacherous. The brief sense of peace within the cabin was shattered by the roar of an engine, a heavy, guttural sound that signaled a vehicle with four-wheel drive. Elias looked out the window and his heart sank. It was a massive, dark green truck, the kind that could conquer any snowdrift. It belonged to Silas Croft. Croft was more than Elias's landlord. He owned the bank that held the mortgage, the town's only grocery store, and the loyalty of the local sheriff. He was a man who thrived on the quiet desperation of others. Croft lumbered from his truck, a large man wrapped in an expensive parka, his face ruddy from the cold and a perpetual scowl. He didn't bother to knock, shoving the cabin door open with a dismissive heave. His cold eyes swept the room, lingering for a moment on Lena and the children huddled by the fire before settling on Elias with undisguised contempt. "Vance," he boomed, his voice filling the small space. "Thought I might find you still squatting here. The 30 days are up." And then some. Elias rose slowly to his feet, placing himself between Croft and his guests. "There's a blizzard, Croft. The roads have been closed." "Not for me. They ain't," Croft sneered, kicking a bit of snow from his boot onto the clean floor. "I don't care about the weather. I care about my money. You have it." Elias's silence was answer enough. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had nothing, less than nothing. Croft's eyes narrowed, a cruel glint appearing within them. "I knew it. You people are all the same. Can't manage your own affairs. Think the world owes you something because you put on a uniform for a few years." The slur, veiled as it was, hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Elias felt a hot surge of anger, the old soldier in him wanting to rise up, but he forced it down. He would not give this man the satisfaction. Lena, however, had risen from her seat by the fire, her expression transformed. The fear and vulnerability were gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "That's enough," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority that made Croft turn in surprise. He looked her up and down, a dismissive smirk on his face. "And who are you?" "Some stray he took in. He gave us shelter from the storm," Lena said, her voice level. "He's a good man." "He's a broke man," Croft shot back, turning his attention back to Elias. "And this is my property. I want you out. I'll give you 24 hours to clear out your junk. After that, I'm sending the sheriff to drag you out. And I'll have him check on your guests too. Make sure they're not fugitives or something." He let the threat hang in the air before turning and stomping out of the cabin, leaving the door open to the biting cold. Elias stared after him, the weight of utter defeat settling upon him. He had faced enemy fire, buried his wife, and starved in silence, but this felt like the end. Croft had taken his home, insulted his honor, and now threatened the very people he had tried to protect. The 24-hour deadline was a death sentence. In this snow, with no money and nowhere to go, he and Buster would freeze. The air in the cabin was thick with the aftermath of Croft's venomous visit. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over Elias. He sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. He had nothing left. No options, no hope. He stared into the dying embers of the fire, seeing his own future turn to ash. Lena watched him, her expression a mixture of sympathy and a simmering, controlled rage. She walked over to the mantelpiece and gently picked up the small wooden raven. She turned it over in her hands, her thumb stroking the smooth, dark wood. "My husband's on his way," she said, her voice pulling Elias from his dark thoughts. "He and some friends. They'll be here soon." Elias shook his head wearily. "It won't matter. Croft owns this town. He'll have the sheriff with him. I don't want you and your kids getting caught up in my trouble." "This isn't your trouble anymore, Elias," she said, her tone shifting, gaining a new and surprising steel. "It's ours." She looked directly at him, her eyes intense. "You said your wife, Sarah, carved this?" He nodded. "She loved birds. Said they were free." "Was her name Sarah Vance?" Lena asked, her voice precise. "Did she used to volunteer down at the county legal aid clinic?" Elias frowned, surprised. "Yes. How could you know that?" A sad, grateful smile touched Lena's lips. She slowly pushed up the sleeve of her left arm, revealing the full tattoo Elias had only glimpsed before. It wasn't just a wing. It was a massive, stylized black raven, its wings spread in flight, its claws clutching a single broken chain. In the center of the raven's chest were 2 letters. Years ago, Lena began, her voice soft but powerful. "A young man, barely 20 years old, got into some trouble. He was a good kid, but he ran with a rough crowd before he found us. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the law came down on him hard. They wanted to make an example of him. He had no money, no family to speak for him. He was going to lose his life to the system." She paused, her eyes locked on his. "But a volunteer lawyer, a woman with a kind heart and a fierce sense of justice, took his case. She worked day and night. She believed in him when no one else would. She found the truth, proved his innocence, and got all the charges dropped. She saved him. That boy's name was Marcus, but we call him Saint. He's my husband's right-hand man now." Her gaze drifted to the photo of Sarah. "That lawyer's name was Sarah Vance. The man she saved is my brother-in-law." Elias stared at her, his mind struggling to connect the pieces. His gentle, quiet Sarah, who had spent her weekends helping the disenfranchised, had unknowingly forged a bond with a world he couldn't imagine. "The Iron Ravens," Lena said, tapping the tattoo on her arm. "Never forget a debt, ever. The kindness your wife showed our brother is a debt of honor. And a debt owed to a Vance is a debt owed to all Vances. When I saw that wooden raven on your mantle, I knew. It's our symbol." It felt like a sign the revelation hung in the air. A stunning, impossible twist of fate. The family he had rescued from a blizzard, the people he had given his last scraps of food and warmth to, were connected to him by a thread of kindness woven by his beloved wife years ago. Hope, something Elias thought he had lost forever, began to flicker, a tiny, fragile flame in the frozen landscape of his heart. Just as the impossible truth began to settle in, the sound of Croft's truck returned, this time accompanied by the unmistakable rumble of the Havenwood Sheriff's Department vehicle. The fragile hope in Elias's chest was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold dread. Croft wasn't waiting 24 hours. He was here to finish it. Elias moved instinctively to the door, his body a shield for the family behind him. "Lena, take the children into the back room," he commanded, his voice low and steady, the voice of a soldier assuming his post. She hesitated, her eyes flashing with defiance. "We're not leaving you. Just for a minute," he insisted. "Keep them out of sight. Please." She finally nodded, gathering Caleb and Maya and retreating to the small bedroom, leaving the door cracked open. The front door burst open again. This time, Silas Croft stood there flanked by Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly. Brody had been a decent man once, but years of being under Croft's thumb had worn him down to a compliant, weary official. "Vance," Brody said, his eyes avoiding Elias's. "Mr. Croft here has filed a formal complaint. Says you're trespassing. And he has reason to believe you're harboring fugitives." "They're not fugitives," Elias stated, his voice ringing with conviction. "They're a mother and her children whose car crashed in the storm. I gave them shelter. It's the decent thing to do." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Decency doesn't pay the bills. This is my property. I want you and them out. Now, you have an eviction notice," Elias challenged, his gaze fixed on the sheriff. Brody shuffled his feet. "Well, not the official court order, but Silas, Mr. Croft. He's the owner." "Then you have no legal right to enter my home or remove me," Elias said, his stance unwavering. He was terrified. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but he would not back down. He had given his word, and more than that, he had a duty to protect the people under his roof. This was his final stand. He was choosing to be arrested, to be thrown out into the snow with nothing, rather than betray the trust of the family he had saved. It was the ultimate test of his integrity, and he was meeting it head-on, even if it meant his own ruin. "I've had enough of this," Croft snarled, his face turning a blotchy red. "Brody, get him out of the way. We're going in." The sheriff took a reluctant step forward, his hand hovering near his sidearm. "Elias, don't make this harder than it has to be." It was the moment of breaking. The world seemed to narrow to the space of the doorway, to the choice between surrender and destruction. Elias braced himself. He would not move. And then, a new sound began to permeate the air. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the distinct, thunderous roar of multiple powerful engines. It was a sound that did not belong in the snow-choked silence of Havenwood. Croft and Sheriff Brody froze, turning their heads toward the road. Elias's heart leaped into his throat. Over the crest of the hill they appeared. It was a sight so improbable, so utterly out of place, that it seemed like a hallucination. Convoy. At the lead were two massive, blacked-out pickup trucks with plows on the front, carving a path through the deep snow. And behind them, a procession of motorcycles, their tires fitted with chains, their engines roaring in a symphony of raw power. They moved with a disciplined, almost military precision. The bikes pulled up in a semicircle, blocking the road, their riders clad in black leather cuts bearing the same insignia as Lena's tattoo. A formidable, soaring raven. The Iron Ravens had arrived. The doors of the lead truck opened and several men stepped out. They were large, imposing figures, their faces hard and weathered, but their movements were calm and controlled. From the passenger side emerged a man who was clearly their leader. He was tall and powerfully built, with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that missed nothing. He walked with an air of quiet, absolute authority. Lena rushed out from the cabin. "Preacher!" she cried, running to him. He wrapped her in a fierce hug, his hard expression melting into one of profound relief as he kissed her, and then knelt to embrace his children. This was her husband. After ensuring his family was safe, Preacher rose to his full height and turned his attention to the scene at the cabin door. His calm, assessing gaze fell on Croft, then on the sheriff, and finally on Elias. He walked forward, his boots crunching in the snow, and extended a hand to Elias. "You must be Elias Vance," he said, his voice a low, respectful baritone. "My name is John. People call me Preacher. My wife told me what you did. There aren't words to thank you for saving my family." Elias, stunned, shook his hand. "I only did what was right." Preacher nodded slowly, his eyes conveying a deep understanding. "That's a rarer thing than you might think." He then turned his unervingly calm gaze to Silas Croft, whose arrogant bluster had evaporated, replaced by a pale, sweaty fear. "I understand you're the owner of this property," Preacher said, his tone deceptively mild. "And you were in the process of evicting Mr. Vance and threatening my wife and children," Croft sputtered. This is a private matter," He owes me money. Money, Preacher repeated, as if the word were a curious artifact. He pulled out a phone and made a call, speaking in a low voice. Run a check on a man named Silas Croft in Havenwood. Full financial, property holdings, the works. I want to know everything. He listened for a moment. And get our lawyer on the line. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely annihilated. The sheriff stood frozen, looking from the intimidating bikers to Croft, his face a mask of bewildered terror. Croft's authority, built on small-town bullying, was utterly useless against this new, incomprehensible force. Within minutes, Preacher's phone buzzed. He listened, a grim expression settling on his face. Predatory lending, dozens of fraudulent foreclosure filings, tax evasion. I see. He hung up and looked at Croft, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. It seems, Mr. Croft, that you've been a very busy man. My legal team is currently faxing a comprehensive file of your activities to the State Attorney General's office. I imagine they'll be very interested to hear about your business practices. He then turned to Sheriff Brody. And as for you, Sheriff, you have a choice. You can continue to be this man's puppet and face charges of conspiracy and malfeasance, or you can start doing your actual job and place Mr. Croft under arrest for harassment and attempted illegal eviction. Brody, seeing his career and freedom flashing before his eyes, made his choice. He turned, his hand now steady, and faced his longtime master. Silas, he said, his voice shaking but firm. You're under arrest. The spectacle was just beginning. Preacher made another call. We're a go on the Havenwood acquisition, he said simply. He turned to Elias, whose mind was still reeling. Mr. Vance, the Iron Ravens are, among other things, a veteran support network and a logistics conglomerate. We own a number of businesses. As of 5 minutes ago, that includes a controlling interest in the Havenwood County Bank. He gestured to one of his men, who came forward with a briefcase. He opened it and produced a folder. We've taken the liberty of clearing your mortgage. In fact, we've bought the property outright. He handed the folder to Elias. Inside was the deed to the cabin and the 10 acres of land it sat on. Free and clear. Elias's name was printed in bold, official type. He stared at it, speechless, his hands trembling as he held the document that represented a lifetime of security he never dreamed he would have. But Preacher wasn't finished. That clears the bank's books, he said. It does not, however, clear our family's debt to yours. Another man stepped forward and handed Elias a certified check. Elias looked down at the number written on it and felt his knees go weak. It was an astronomical sum, more money than he had ever seen in his life. The memo line read simply, "For Sarah Vance, debt of honor." Tears welled in Elias's eyes, blurring the ink on the check. He looked at Preacher, at Lena, at the stoic, leather-clad men surrounding him, and for the first time in 2 years, he did not feel alone. The cavalry had arrived, but they weren't just there to save him. They were there to rebuild him. As if on cue, the back of one of the large trucks opened, and the Ravens began unloading supplies with practiced efficiency. A mountain of split firewood, boxes overflowing with food, a brand-new, whisper-quiet generator, power tools, and stacks of lumber. Your cabin has good bones, Preacher said with a smile, but it could use some work. My men are contractors in their other lives. We'd be honored if you'd let us help you winterize it properly. Elias, overwhelmed and unable to speak, could only nod, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. The cascade of kindness was so immense, so absolute. It was like being caught in a tidal wave of grace. The quiet desperation that had been his life's companion for so long was being washed away, replaced by a dawning, unbelievable light. The arrival of the Iron Ravens sent shockwaves through the quiet town of Havenwood. Their presence was impossible to ignore. The sight of 24 formidable bikers working methodically on Elias Vance's cabin became the biggest news the town had seen in decades. They were a study in disciplined force. One crew expertly repaired the roof, another installed new, double-paned windows, and a third insulated the walls. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the howl of the wind, a chorus of construction and renewal. The story of what had happened spread with the speed of gossip in a small town. It started with Sheriff Brody's shamefaced account at the local diner, detailing Silas Croft's arrest and the stunning intervention. People learned of Croft's years of predatory practices, and suddenly, others found their courage. The elderly Mrs. Gable, who had lost her farm to Croft a decade earlier. The Miller family, who had been paying exorbitant interest on a small loan for years. One by one, they came forward, their stories tumbling out, a dam of fear finally broken. The Iron Raven's lawyers, a sharp, efficient team that had flown into the nearest city, set up a temporary office in the town hall, offering free consultations to anyone who had been victimized by Croft. The community was forced to look at itself and at Elias in a new light. He was no longer the quiet, solitary black veteran on the edge of town, a figure of pity or suspicion. He was the catalyst, the man whose simple, profound act of decency had brought a giant to its knees and exposed the cancer at the heart of their town. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now drove slowly past his property, their expressions a mixture of awe and shame. A few, the braver ones, stopped. Mr. Henderson, the hardware store owner, arrived with a new wood-burning stove, a top-of-the-line model. Insisting it was a donation to a local hero, the ladies from the church baking committee brought pies, casseroles, and bread. Their initial nervousness around the bikers quickly dissolving when a hulking man named Grizz complimented their apple crumble with surprising gentleness. Elias, meanwhile, was in the center of this whirlwind of transformation. The Ravens treated him not as a project, but as family. They worked alongside him, listening to his stories about Sarah, about his time in the service. They shared meals with him at his newly reinforced kitchen table, filling his small, once silent cabin with laughter and camaraderie. Preacher and Elias would often sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the work wind down. "Sarah would have liked you," Elias said one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "She always saw the good in people, even when they didn't see it in themselves." Preacher looked out at his men, his family of outcasts and warriors. "She saw the good in one of us," he replied, "and that was enough to save all of us." Kindness like that, Elias, it ripples, it doesn't die. You proved that when you opened your door to my family. In less than a week, the cabin was transformed. It was no longer a shack on the verge of collapse, but a warm, solid, beautiful home. The Ravens had installed a new furnace, rewired the electricity, and even built a sturdy new kennel for Buster, who basked in the attention and the endless supply of jerky treats from the bikers. On their last day, Preacher presented Elias with a leather cut of his own. It was plain, without club patches, but on the back, sewn with incredible skill, was the image of a single, soaring black raven. "You're not a member," Preacher explained, "but you are our brother. This is a symbol. It means that anywhere, anytime, you have a family to call on. No one will ever trouble you again." Elias held the heavy leather vest in his hands, a symbol of belonging he never expected to feel again. He had lost his wife, his career, and his home. And now, in the aftermath of a blizzard, he had found a new purpose, a new home, and a new, fiercely loyal family. The town of Havenwood was healing, and so was he. 6 months later, summer had laid its warm, golden hand over Havenwood. The brutal cold of the blizzard was a distant memory, a story that was already becoming a local legend. Elias Vance's property was unrecognizable. The cabin, now painted a deep forest green, was pristine. A sturdy new porch wrapped around the front, complete with a comfortable rocking chair. Where there had once been frozen, barren ground, there was now a thriving garden bursting with tomatoes, cucumbers, and sunflowers that nodded their heavy heads in the gentle breeze. The change in the land was a mirror of the change in the man. Elias moved with a new lightness, the deep lines of desperation erased from his face. He was no longer just surviving, he was building. Using a portion of the funds the Ravens had given him, he had established the Sarah Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing emergency aid, legal services, and support for veterans and families in crisis throughout the county. The foundation's small office, located in the very building Croft had once owned, was a beacon of hope for the community. He wasn't alone in this endeavor. Many of the townspeople, their hearts opened by the recent upheaval, volunteered their time. Mr. Henderson managed the finances, and the ladies from the church organized food drives. The town, once fractured by suspicion and fear, was slowly knitting itself back together, united by a shared purpose. The Iron Ravens were a regular, welcome sight. At least once a month, a contingent would ride in, not with thunderous intimidation, but with warm smiles and offers of help. They'd spend the weekend helping Elias with foundation projects, playing with the local kids, and sharing a barbecue in his yard. They were no longer seen as dangerous outsiders, but as honored friends, the unlikely guardians of Havenwood's newfound conscience. This evening, Elias sat in his rocking chair on the porch, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. Buster dozed at his feet, his tail thumping a lazy rhythm against the wood. Preacher sat in the chair beside him, while Lena watched Caleb and Maya chase fireflies in the twilight. The air was soft and smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. It was a scene of perfect peace, a peace Elias had earned in the heart of a storm. "It's a good life you've built here, my friend," Preacher said quietly. Elias looked out at the vibrant garden, at the lights of the town twinkling in the valley below, at the laughing children. He thought of the cold, the hunger, the utter desolation of that winter night. He thought of the single can of soup and the choice he had made. It was a choice to share his last ember of warmth in a world that had gone cold. He never could have imagined it would ignite a bonfire. "It's a good life we've all built," Elias corrected him, a deep and lasting contentment settling in his soul. He had learned the most profound of truths, that a single act of selfless compassion is never an ending. It is always, in some unforeseen and miraculous way, a beginning. It is a seed planted in the frozen earth, waiting for the right moment to grow and change the world. If the story of Elias Vance and the Iron Ravens has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness is the most powerful force on earth. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspirational stories that prove the human spirit